Welcome, all of you. Thank you for joining us. We're here in honor of David Treuer and tonight's lecture, The Savage Mind, Understanding Violence in America. David is this semester's Holtzbrinck Fellow at the American Academy. The Holtzbrinck Fellowship at the Academy began in 1999, very close to the founding of the Academy, and with the generous support of the Holtzbrinck Publishing Group to promote German-American dialogue in the fields of journalism, fiction, and academia. We're very grateful to the Holtzbrinck family for their continuing support, in particular the Academy's trustee and vice chairman, Stefan von Holtzbrinck. Over the years, this fellowship has made it possible for outstanding American academics, journalists, and writers to join us here at the Academy as fellows. Among them, names you might recognize, such as Alex Ross, Hilton Als, Jonathan Safran Foer, Anne Hall, Nicole Krauss, Sigrid Nunez, George Packer, and tonight also David Treuer. David is an exceptionally prolific and creative individual who continues to make significant contributions to the American life and letters. You may have even seen him just this week in New Yorker's edition in which he reviews the book Indigenous Continent by Finnish historian Pekka Hämäläinen. Excuse my... I'm still working on my Finnish. German first. David is a best-selling author, and when he's not in Berlin, he divides his time between his home in Los Angeles and on the Leech Lake Reservation in northern Minnesota. Go Midwest. And in LA, he's a professor of English at the University of Southern California. His work is celebrated for its ability to bridge the gap between the past and the present. His books often weave together stories from different eras, allowing readers to gain a deeper understanding of the complexity of Native American history. His work is also noted for its attention to detail, as David is meticulous in his research and does not shy away from difficult topics, as you will also hear tonight. He's written extensively about the trauma of colonialism and the legacy of racism, as well as resilience of Native American culture. He is the author of numerous books, including The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, which was a finalist for the National Book Award and a Carnegie Medal. His essays and stories have appeared in numerous prestigious magazines, and his awards include a Pushcart Prize, 2 Minnesota Book Awards, a California Book Award Gold Medal, and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Bush Foundation, and the Guggenheim Foundation. And in his Academy project, which you are about to hear more about, David explores the huge and sadly ever-growing problem of violence in American schools and streets, identifying and fleshing out a defining contradiction in American identity between a national self-perception of its own goodness and the reality of immense national violence. The Savage Mind also shares David's story of coming of age in America, from growing up Native American on the reservation in Minnesota to attending Princeton University and to the growth of his own family, both in LA and Minnesota. He also looks to the legacy of his mother's Ojibwe childhood and his father's experiences as a Holocaust survivor and refugee from Vienna in 1938, and that's quite a mix. David, I'm really, really looking forward to hearing you speak more. I'm only sorry that I didn't arrive at the Academy earlier to get to know you and your family better, but I hope better late than never, at least. Before I hand the floor over to you, I'd just like to make a few housekeeping remarks about tonight. David will speak for about 40 minutes, and right after we'll have a Q&A with the audience. If you're here with us in person and you have a question at that time, please raise your hand. A microphone will come to you, and please make sure that your question is indeed a question. And if you're joining us via Zoom, please type your question into the Q&A box. Don't raise your hand, and keep the questions coming. So, David, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you all. It's so nice to be here and see all of your smiling masks. I'm really grateful and really honored. And I'd like to thank the Academy. I'm always afraid that when I mention people I want to thank, I'm forgetting somebody. And so my tactic is always to mention nobody. And that way I'm forgetting no one. So I'd like to thank the entire Academy, admin, the kitchen especially, and my fellows who've been an inspiration and great company. Although, Josh, you still owe me some drinks. So it's a real pleasure to be here. So I was kind of, and I feel like it's the Christmas season, right? The Christmas markets are open. You know, we're supposed to buy glühwein, eat sausages, do things like that. So I kind of felt like you guys should have some choice as to what I talk about tonight. I like to keep the car up on two wheels at all times. So you have your choice between a meaty but relatively undigested middle section of the book I'm working on. Right? That's obviously going to be your first choice. Or the very beginning of it, which is, well, I don't know, new. And, or a piece I wrote in the New York Times recently, or about my parents. And it will be in the book, too. Or a ribald story about when I was 13 and I found a bunch of pornography in the ditch, which I then brought back to my bedroom, and then the house burnt down. You don't really want that one. That one's funny, but it's not on topic. Well, I'm presenting the illusion of choice. The illusion of choice. Although, right, when I found that stuff, it was a great day until the house burnt down, which wasn't my fault, for once. My son doesn't believe me. It's true. I think I'll read the beginning. Is that okay? There isn't a lot of framing in this section, I will say, so we can get to the bigger questions about the book itself and sort of what's behind it, maybe during the question and answer, if that's okay. All right, here we go. I was 7 in 1978 when my brother and I were sent to our ancestral village of Bina to stay with our cousin Delbert and we call him Del, and my Aunt Shirley and Uncle Diddy for a long weekend. The village is only 17 miles from the house I grew up in on the edge of the Leech Lake Reservation, but Bina felt, and it still does feel, like a different world. It's a hard place, a place you can break yourself on. Even though the village is small, 140 people or so, all of them poor, mixed native and white, all of them related to us in some way or another, even though it's small, all of it and all of them felt to me, in the glory of my hard-earned softness and innocence that is the birthright of the American middle class, profoundly unsafe. I felt it, that lack of safety, that precariousness, if not outright danger, when we passed the Big Fish restaurant on Highway 2, while we were still miles away. And it would continue to grow, this feeling, when we turned at the gas station and passed the community center and the Big Winnie bar, and inevitably, it peaked when we rolled up in my grandparents' sandy driveway. After our visits, the feeling didn't entirely subside until we pulled into our driveway and I felt the trees around our house close in over me. That feeling that things could pop off at any moment. That you could be minding your own business and all of a sudden it could be that someone was in your face and what the fuck are you going to do about it? Would be the first words you'd hear, and then it was on. Or we could be walking barefoot through town with our cousins because none of the streets were paved in those days, and someone would be walking behind you with their cousins, and they'd say, "Hey, you." And the hot, dusty streets and empty lots with turned-over wash tubs rusting in the grass and the clacking of grasshoppers and the power lines strung poorly overhead, all of it would stop, and my pulse would quicken, and I'd feel my lunch in my throat. It felt like this always, no matter if we were spending an afternoon at my grandparents' house or a weekend with my uncles, the exception being the time I spent with my Uncle Davy, after whom I'm named, whom I adored. And when I didn't want to leave his house, he'd do things like offer to drive me all the way home using only his feet, which he did, wearing only a bandana and his jeans, while, since this was the 1970s, smoking reefer, which he held delicately in his left hand. And he did drive me home, 17 miles, using only his feet. Our parents dropped us off with Diddy and Shirley, and then they were gone. I don't know where. When I asked them later, they shrugged. When I asked my mother, why did you think this was a good idea? She's like, I love Diddy. It's not a good answer. Dell was a year or two younger than me. And even then, at 6 or 7, because to be honest, I can't remember exactly what year this all went down, even then he was tougher than me by a long shot. Once our parents drove away, Diddy and Shirley told us there were 2 pizzas in the freezer, not to leave the house, and not to fuck it up. Which might have been the house as easily as it meant the evening or our lives. It was hard to tell. And then they left. We had no schedule, no plan, no structured events, no camp counselors or the promise of s'mores or sing-alongs or any kind of organized activity. This was Leech Lake. This was the res. What we did have were the empty lots and abandoned shacks and sandy roads and the freedom to run it from Highway 2 to the dump on the south side of town. We had the sense then that the sun would never set, and so the sun was greedy for the sky. We visited my grandmother's brother, Boobsy. These are all real names, by the way. Boobsy, he was great. I loved him. He did 35 years in the federal pen for robbing a jewelry depository place, and his buddy shot someone in the course of the robbery. His buddy was shot, and Boobsy went to jail for 35 years. They kept letting him out because he was a nice guy. And then he'd mess up and he'd wind back up in jail, and you know. Finally, he went up for parole once. And he's like, "Look, don't give it to me. I want to do my time. I want to do it, and when I'm done, I'm done." And they're like, "Okay." So, anyway, nice guy. He lived in this pathologically tidy tar paper shack with a narrow iron cot covered in green wool camp blanket, tucked in with hospital corners, which he learned at the pen. After visiting him, we walked down 6 Mile Road, but were eventually oppressed by the road, the aspen that crowded the shoulder, and the endless inevitability of the road itself. It was, like most of us, taking forever, going exactly nowhere. So we turned around. Back at the house, we put the tombstones, ironic, in the oven, but took them out too soon, and the slices sagged and gleamed coldly in the lamplight, and so we had a pizza fight. As one does. And before long, there was pizza everywhere except where it was supposed to be. As one piece slowly slid down the curved screen of their old TV, we took out a flat of eggs, and cradling them in the pouches of our upturned T-shirts, we decided we were going to egg the entire town. The town wasn't much, to be honest. 50 or 60 houses, a small post office and community center, a bar, a grocery store, and a gas station. Bina is only famous for 2 things. The gas station, which is on the historical register, as an example of folk Ukrainian architecture. I don't know why this is the case. And it's also famous for having the highest number of convicted felons per capita, higher than anywhere else in the United States. And this is my family. As for the bar, it's a cinder block piece of shit because the old bar burned down. At one time, Bina was a going concern and had 3 gas stations, 2 churches, a hardware store, 7 hotels, and 2 bars. My great-grandfather, Harris Matthews, a Scottish bootlegger from Chicago, at one time owned both bars. One was called the Kiddigan, which is a corruption of the Ojibwe word Gittigan, which means garden. So like a beer garden. And the other was called the Wigwam, of course. And in one of those ironies that is unique to this town, when my great-grandfather, Grandpa Harris Matthews, owned the Wigwam bar, my grandfather's mother lived in a wigwam, a literal wigwam, within sight of the bar. No one I've ever talked to has had anything nice to say about Harris. No one. He wore an eye patch, and he intimated that he lost it in the Great War, but really, he lost it to shingles. He favored Scotch caps with ear flaps. My grandmother said that when he was coming back to the village by train and the village kids gathered on the platform, he tossed nickels into the throng, comprised mostly of his own children, which there were 9 of them. My mother told me that he could pound a nail with either hand and that he was completely ambidextrous. That's the only nice thing I've heard about him. My great-aunt Millie told me that at one time he was fixing the roof on one of his bars, the Wigwam, and someone walked by and they said, "Hey, Harris, what you doing? Building a whorehouse?" And he turned, he paused, he looked down at the guy on the street, and he says, "You know, if I was building a whorehouse, I'd have to put a roof over the whole goddamn town." So much for Grandpa Harris. So, we egged the Catholic Church, we egged the rectory of the church, we egged the grocery store, we did not egg my grandparents' house, and finally, my brother held the door open while Dell threw eggs in the Bina bar. I don't know where Diddy and Shirley were. Hell, they were probably in the bar. But they weren't home when we got home. We scraped the pizza off the TV, turned it on, TV. I have no memory of what was on. I only think 2 stations came in anyway, so it was probably Rat Patrol or Combat or something like that. It was dark now, truly dark. So it must have been past 10:30, thereabouts. Night had dropped down over us in the village, and it fell hard, and it separated the already separated houses, yard by yard, light by light, a great and final closing of the day. We watched TV, listless, hungry, bored, and then we noticed something. A light from down the road that grew brighter and brighter like the headlights of an approaching car. We parted the curtains, we were looking out the window, and between the trees and abandoned lots, we could see a house on fire. We knew from the flames which one it was, some abandoned cabin a few yards down from my other uncle Bumsy's shack. These are real names. It was common knowledge in the village those days that there was a firebug, as my mother called her, or him. We had our suspicions, who liked nothing better than to go around and every few weeks or so burn down another abandoned building. They could, I imagine, live a long, happy, productive life burning down this or that thing in Bina every few months because there were a lot of empties around the village. Rumor was it was Dell's sister Joy who was doing the burning. Maybe she was, but on this night, she was 17 miles away at my house watching my little brother and sister. And then the phone rang. Dell answered. And as the seconds ticked and ticked and then grew and slowed and finally stopped, Dell's eyes grew wider. The woman on the other end of the line said, "We know Joy burned that house down, and so we're fucking coming over there and we're going to burn your fucking house down with you in it." Then she hung up. The night yawned like a mouth. We were pinned to the earth, to the moment, by fear. You know, we could have run to my grandparents' house, across the road to my Uncle Howard's. We could have even run across town to the Bina bar, warm with light and people and beer. We didn't do any of those things. Our mouths, our feet, our imaginations, none of them worked. Deprived of everything, or better, having deprived ourselves of our imaginations, which are in all honesty the only thing that'll save anybody, we instead did something very American. We found a gun. A single-shot break-action 20 gauge. We loaded it, gave it to my brother since he was the oldest, and we all three sat on the couch facing the door, the hammer drawn back, the barrel resting on my brother's bent knees, and we waited to blow the head off of the first person who came through that door. When I think back on it, on that moment, I think about how quickly the violence out there entered the house, and how, despite how young we were, we accepted this as nothing more and nothing less than life. Life itself. This is what we were for. This is what the village was for. This is what the reservation was for, and this was what life was supposed to be like. I mean, guns, real and metaphorical, were being pulled on us all the time. And we pointed them, really and metaphorically, at other people all the time. Violent intent, and the guns to back it up, had been a part of the cascade of treaties signed in 1855, in 1864, and 1867 that established my reservation. Violence was a part of everything, a central aspect of our social disposition. I felt it when we arrived at the village for our visits. I felt it behind the words of my grandfather when we came running through his house. And he who would shoot himself in the head and die on his bedroom floor 30 years later, when he would say, "Get the fuck out of here." We felt it in the stares and snide superiority we'd come to expect from the white people around us. You could practically smell it when you opened the door to the Bina Bar or Muni Liquors or the Big Tap in Cass Lake, where it felt something was always going to go wrong and where it almost always did. When I think back, and in my own darker moments, I've gotten in the habit of seeing that the reservation was clearly meant for such things. A place of violence, of absolute darkness, a night fully on, with a house burning in the distance and a loaded gun pointed at the door, ready to blast through the door frame and into the yard, from its own brittle little mouth, some kind of answer. What I couldn't see then, though, is what I can see now. And it is all that I can see. That the violence I'd always assumed that was out there wasn't. It had gone in here. It was inside me as much as, if not more than, it was out there. Because of all the choices I could have made or we could have made to flee to my grandparents, to Howard's, to the bar, I made the one that made the most sense to me. To wait, ready, with a loaded gun, prepared totally, or so I thought, to empty it into the head of whoever came through the door. In 2015, many years later, I moved into a small back house in California, a necessary step in a divorce that was ugly and would remain so for nearly a year. I had initially traded spaces with my soon-to-be ex, and then for a year I lived above a garage in Pomona on a pull-out couch. And until you've done that, you haven't lived. Highly recommend. These were awful times. One night my kids, two of whom are here tonight, one of whom is not, were all asleep. They had until that time slept together in this little kind of nest of like innocence and goodness. I was up because I couldn't sleep. I had, at this point, moved into a house. I was off the pull-out couch. My kids were with me, finally and again. And so this night in 2015, I was up. I couldn't sleep because earlier that day, 14 people had been murdered and 20 wounded in San Bernardino. And I was suddenly afraid for my kids, as mostly brown children in the world, for myself, as the person impossibly who was supposed to protect them, and afraid for the country, too. I wondered then, what my parents would do if my life were theirs. It was hard to imagine. It was hard to imagine them together at all, even though they'd been together for the first 24 years of my life. When they were getting divorced, I'd gone for a walk and stumbled on them both sitting in lawn chairs near their family sweat lodge they both tended. They were there literally to pull the lodge apart, and I was shocked then because it was the first time I remember them being in something close to agreement about anything. They were both sad, both contemplative, both staring at the frame of sticks that had once been theirs together, and symbolically at least, represented something about their union. I wondered what they would do. My father was dying of Alzheimer's at the time. my mother was struggling with cancer at the time. I couldn't ask. So just like their lives have been pulled apart, I felt like mine was being pulled apart as well, between the one I'd been living with my children and soon-to-be ex, and the one unknown and unknowable to which I was headed. It was as if some dispassionate tinkerer had made a series of small cuts and extracted the spine, the plot and structure of my life, as if to say, let's see. Let's see what happens now. In a strong bid for mimesis in 2015, the same cuts seemed to be happening to America. The country that, like my parents, both birthed and plagued me. The same unknowing, the same uncertainty, the same darkness descending on the horizon and creeping ever closer. I didn't have the answers to what happened then, or what happens now between me and the end of my life. But I did know this in 2015. I was the sum of my parents' faults and their ambitions. My father was nothing if not intense. Often when I was a kid, intensely angry, but also intensely emotional, a deep feeler whose emotions often ran a little too close to the surface. Despite his emotional architecture, or perhaps because of it, he approached his jobs and his life as an opportunity to make the world better. Much, if not all, of that drive had to do with the fact that America had very directly and very simply saved his life. Austria, the country of his birth, tried to kill him. America saved him. But then there was my mother, who as a Native woman grew up as an outsider in her country, for whom America was a constant threat, a country seemingly determined to grind her down and against whom all of her skeptical ferocity was aimed. And so I grew up the recipient of both my parents' attitudes about the Republic, if not the recipient of their emotional patrimony and matrimony. I was just perplexed. There I was, 2015, scrolling the news about the shooting in San Bernardino, blinking confusedly in the light of my personal and patriotic wars. What to do? What to do for my kids? What to do about them? What to do for this country? What to do about it? What to do about myself? I didn't know. Unable to help myself, I cracked the door and slid into my boys' room and lay on the floor. I could hear the music of their sleep around me, and I was brought back helplessly to that night in Bina. The fire, the fear, the gun. I didn't know much of anything, least of which was how to keep our violence from entering my children. I don't know how long we sat on that couch. I don't know if I've actually stopped sitting on that couch. We were there a long time, pinned to the cushions, the pizza, in my imagination, continuing to slide down the curved face of the television. Eventually, we saw headlights spray the front of the house from right to left, and then center on the door and the front window. The car was shut off. The lights went out all at once. We heard one door open and slam, then another. This was it. The window was open, and I saw the curtain fabric suck against the screen as one person, and then two, walked past. I could hear their boots on the sand in the driveway and on the gravel of the front walk. We knew. We just knew. We were going to die. The door opened. My brother steadied the gun, and he paused. He paused long enough to see, and for me and Dell to see, my Uncle Diddy weaving unsteadily in the doorway. It was our first time pointing a gun at someone, but it was not Diddy's first time having a gun pointed at him. In 2 steps, he was across the room, and he swept the gun from my brother's hands. What the fuck's going on here? We all spoke at once. The fire, the call, the threat. We were going to shoot them when they came over. No one's shooting shit. Go to bed. He broke the action of the gun open, plucked out the shot shell as he and Shirley stumbled back to their bedroom. With nothing to do, we went to bed. Dell and my brother fell asleep almost immediately. I couldn't. I heard them, my brother and my cousin, breathing heavily, and through the thin bedroom wall they shared, I heard Diddy and Shirley's bed springs sing. I heard, too, the mosquitoes whining against the screen, and beyond them other insects and frogs, and the swamp, and the overall chorus of that outer dark. Something was wrong out there, and something was wrong inside, and something more was being said between the two wrongs, each to each. And I'm trying to figure out what that is. That's the beginning. Thank you. Also, it's a first draft. And by that I mean, like, I haven't looked at it since I wrote it. So, indulgences, please. You should have picked The Porno in the Ditch. You can never go wrong. Never go wrong with that. Never go wrong. It's a good story. Yeah. But now I think we're open for questions, right? How much time was that? I didn't time it either, so. 25 minutes? Do you want to just hear the...
You have time.
I mean, it's kind of funny. The votes are in? Okay. If you want it, you got it. My family was very strange. This is the more comic side of the family. I have lots of ambition, right? Obviously. One of my biggest ambitions was to be funny in print. It's very hard. It's very hard to be funny in print. So I'm actually really proud of this. It's hard for me to say that. You want to hear it? It's okay. All right, here we go. It's our last thing for the semester. So, like, this is my gift to you. My childhood. You're welcome. When I was 13, I had no idea who I was. My family didn't seem to know either. Sometimes I'd walk downstairs into the kitchen looking for a snack, and my mom would be at the table smoking a Merit and drinking coffee while she read the paper. In 1983, everyone still read the paper. But my mom read it with vigor and suspicion, as though it was there in the Bemidji Pioneer that she would find evidence that the world was indeed out to get her. Hearing my shuffling steps, she'd look up and say, "Who are you?" Okay, so she didn't say that out loud, but she definitely said it in her mind. Because the truth was, I was not in the kitchen for a snack. I was there to purloin some Crisco before skulking back to my room for more self-abuse. How did she know? Maybe I was more transparent than I thought. No amount of hair gel or deodorant could disguise the fact that I wasn't, in fact, a 13-year-old boy, but a cringing, sex-obsessed demon whose nearest relatives were the monsters in my hardbound copy of Dungeons & Dragons Fiend Folio. Or maybe, because my mom's native, the spirits told her what I was up to. I still don't know. Sometimes, as a child, I had to speak to my parents. There was no way around it. So I'd hover by the door to my father's study until he noticed me with a mixture of surprise and annoyance. "Who are you?" he'd ask after I'd been standing there for a few years, growing thinner and weaker, but still determined to get my allowance. My father actually did ask me that, more than once, but he meant it differently. He was asking about my character and about my direction in life. Those were the words he used while I stood there, my eyes squeezed shut, muttering to myself, "I'm a boy, I'm a real boy." Now that I think about it, after spending years trying not to think about it, my father was probably practicing on me the kinds of questions he was only then learning to ask himself. He was a Holocaust survivor, and that was largely how he thought of himself. More often than not, that's how he introduced himself, no matter where he went. My name is Bob Treuer. I'm a Holocaust survivor. It's one thing to address the monthly meeting of the Bemidji Rotary Club or JCs that way, another to greet my D&D friends at the door with a handshake. Bob Treuer, Holocaust survivor. Your dad, said one of my friends, your dad is very weird. True. Also true. He learned English by listening to the radio in Yellow Springs, Ohio, where he and his parents settled after they were reunited after their fleeing. He was brilliant, good with languages, so he lost his German accent almost immediately, but he was never able to shake the mid-Atlantic radio voice he replaced it with. He might have looked like Billy Wilder, but he sounded like Edward R. Murrow. At a restaurant, I will have the pancakes. Thank you, and good night. So I had no answer for my parents about who I was, because I had no answer for myself. Part of the problem, actually most of the problem, probably had to do with my head. It's not that I was just troubled psychologically or emotionally, or that I had mood swings and moments of black anger. I mean, I had literal head trouble. I'd been hit by a car in 3rd grade, and my skull was fractured, and the top of my foot had been ripped off like the skin of a clementine. The foot didn't bother me all that much. My head, though, it was pretty bad. I had crushing headaches that made me dizzy, that weaponized the light. At first, after the accident, I got them every day. Gradually, they decreased to once a week, and by the time I was 13, the headaches came only once or twice a month. I went in for CAT scans and checkups, but according to the doctors, there was nothing wrong with me. My brain looked like the normal American boy brain. I think the diagnostic technology in Bemidji was outdated or biased against weird, furtive boys. Bemidji, home of Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox and water skis and flannel and male pattern baldness, was the first city on the Mississippi. And by that, the city boosters mean it's not the first city built on the Mississippi, it's just the first city on the river as measured from the headwaters. Something had to be first. Downstream, there are bigger, better, more interesting cities. Later on, I suppose, the river's pretty great, as is the rest of the country. But it gets great outside of Bemidji, like many of the people born there. The town is surrounded by 3 Indian reservations, Red Lake, White Earth, and the one I'm from, Leech Lake. There was, and probably still is, a palpable dislike for Native people in Bemidji. Disdain was practically a city ordinance. And our house was right on the edge of the reservation, and if not for the trees, I could have read the sign that actually announces the boundary, which reads, "Welcome to Leech Lake Reservation, home to the Ojibwe people and intergenerational trauma and despair." Okay, it doesn't actually say that, but it feels like it says it. I didn't think a whole lot about the sign and what was behind it, or about Bemidji and what was behind that. Neither Bemidji nor the reservation could help me figure out who I was. The only thing I was sure of was that no one understood me and no one loved me, which is exactly what I told our family cat, Smokey Moses. Smokey because he was gray, and Moses because we found him in the bulrushes by the lake. I was sitting on the couch, feeling a little blue, and petting Smokey Moses when it occurred to me that he didn't judge me. He didn't assess me and find me wanting. He never ever, not once, asked me, "Who are you?" Overcome with love and appreciation, I picked him up and put him on my lap, and I whispered, "No one understands me. No one loves me. No one but you." He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. About 25 years later, I was riding with my brother, who is a total psychopath. I hope you're listening, bro. I was having a bad day, and I'm venting, and we're driving in silence for a while, and he just says in a very low voice, he's like, "Nobody loves me. Nobody understands me." He'd heard the whole thing and held on to the burn for 25 years. Something wrong with that man. I'm telling you now. Smokey understood me, though. So did Gimli, my 12th degree dwarf fighter. I've been playing Gimli in my D&D campaign for years. My brother, the psychopath, was our dungeon master, so Gimli knew what it meant to be in danger. Anton was likely to kill him off when he got around to it. Gimli liked fighting, and he liked mead, and he liked me. I was in my room, and Gimli was telling me how totally cool and powerful I was. I told you I have head trouble. When my father came in, interrupted, he knocked on the door. He actually knocked on the Christie Brinkley poster I'd won at the waterfront that was tacked to my door. Evidently, my father had an idea. David, you're going to have a bar mitzvah. A what? Well, it's a Jewish rite of passage. A threshold you pass over, a door you pass through, as you transition from boy to man. Thank you, and good night. Like, wait, why? So you can be a man. Dad, I'm going to be a man whether we want it or not, right? I'd been reading Freud. You will write an essay about what it means to be a man. What does that mean? I looked away from my father and out the window and noted the sawing of the pines. I'd also been reading Hemingway. By writing it, you will discover what that means. Thank you, and good night. I didn't know what to expect. My brother Anton hadn't been told he needed to cross a threshold or pass through a doorway. I don't know why. When I look back, Anton doesn't really come into focus that much. Obviously, I'm self-centered, but also he moved really fast. He seemed to sprint everywhere, a brown blur in the foreground of my childhood. He ate fast, and he moved fast, and he talked fast. And I didn't know any other Jewish people because there weren't any other Jewish people within hundreds of miles of us. And I don't think my father even knew what a bar mitzvah was. He'd never had one. He'd never been to one. He hadn't even been to temple, ever. He wasn't that kind of Jew. He was the kind common in Vienna before the war who believed in socialism and Beethoven, in the working class and social justice and chamber music. He didn't believe in God. The weeks passed, and then came the fateful day. I went down to the kitchen. There were candles, and there was food. The candles had not been bought for the occasion. I recognized them as the same candles my parents lit during their biannual coupling. I mean, I at least get the last laugh, right? It really is true, though. That's a true detail. My father had cooked pork loin. His pork loins had the most amazing consistency. They were always gray and fibrous. I think my father approached cooking the same way he approached building. Moisture is the enemy. The family looked at me expectantly like I was suddenly going to do a man thing, fill out a 1040, or talk to a contractor about the window seals, or start singing If I Were a Rich Man, or launch into Zorba's dance or something. Good evening, my father said in the voice he saved for special occasions, a sort of Jewish Vincent Price. I'm happy that we can come together to celebrate the moment when David becomes a man. The family all looked at me. My younger brother and sister didn't blink. They were 5. They were waiting for the magic. I wondered whether the transformation would result in, I don't know, the nerve endings becoming less concentrated down here and more evenly distributed through my body. I have no idea what was going to happen. All I knew was that I wanted my bar mitzvah to be short and painless. To that end, I'd spent weeks working on my essay. Good writing is like prosecuting a just war. It should be short and use only as much force as necessary and limit civilian casualties. I had, in fact, spent a lot of time getting ready for my bar mitzvah by reading about the Six-Day War in the book Swift Sword, the historical record of Israel's victory, June 1967. The book, like the war, was short, and the war, like the book, had an American tank at the front. But tanks alone wouldn't save me or the state of Israel. We also needed to win hearts and minds, and in my case, I needed to win my father's. He was a complex man of simple tastes and convictions. The only things he really got excited about, other than Chopin and Brahms, were class struggle, prairie flowers, old-growth pine forests, and John Steinbeck. Anyway, I knew what I had to do. My essay was aimed straight at him. This is an approximation of my essay. What does it mean to be a man? According to Webster's dictionary, man is a noun, an individual human especially, an adult male human. It can also mean husband or lover, or also a bipedal primate mammal that is anatomically related to the great apes, but distinguished especially by notable development of the brain with a resultant capacity for articulate speech and abstract reasoning, minus traumatic brain injury. But what is a man? That is the age-old question that has bedeviled humankind since the beginning of time. The clock ticked. The twins kicked each other under the table. My mom took out another merit. She knew she was going to be in for it for a while. Anton plotted his future attacks. My father was rapt because I may not have been turning into a man exactly, but I was, at least in his mind, turning into a Jew. Gimli is not a man, for instance. And he is a man because every day he wakes up and joins his comrades in the class struggle that is simply put the human struggle. Gimli would join a trade union if he could, but there are no trade unions in Dungeons & Dragons, not even in advanced Dungeons & Dragons. This is because TSR, the makers of D&D, are the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, if you will, but they won't keep Gimli down, and they won't keep me down. To be a man is to rise up, arm in arm with my brothers, not these brothers you see before you, different, better brothers. In the great human drama that is to be the working man. My father began to sob quietly. I must now go forth into the gathering dark because there is a darkness that lies, murmured my father through his tears, on the land. And that darkness is the future, and I must go into it among the people in Reagan's America. I could ask, what is this dark future that lays on the land? But there is no answer blowing in the wind. I don't need an answer. I know the answer. Oh, these staples are fierce. My mom finished her cigarette and picked up the paper. The twins began reaching for the cupcakes. Anton continued plotting. Beautiful, David, my father intoned, and meaningful. And there I was. I'd emerged, blinking into the bright sun of adulthood with no idea what being an adult meant. Equipped only with a Ghostbusters t-shirt and $20. But what man needs more? This man needed more. I needed more of everything. More money, more friends, more muscles. And I needed a sign that I was headed in the right direction. Fall turned to winter, which in Minnesota is pretty much a hate crime. Spring came, then summer. And the only direction I was headed was to Bemidji, where I'd gotten a job peddling an ice cream bike. My parents refused to drive me because they weren't, quote, goddamn chauffeurs, end quote. I got paid 10 cents per bar sold. And the bike wasn't actually a bike. It was like a tricycle with a big cooler on the front. I checked it out at 8, began pedaling around Bemidji. The bike weighed 120 pounds, which was about 30 more than I weighed. Sometimes at the end of my shift, I had to pay my boss because I had eaten more bars than I'd sold. My boss was a Vietnam veteran and a former actor on The Young and the Restless. He had huge biceps. This is true. Bleached hair, a uniform tan. And he'd always talk about M16s all the time. M16 is a good weapon, he'd tell me, and the other kids, with more emotion than any adult should show discussing any topic. I could hit a 2-inch spread at 400 yards, he'd say, looking off over Lake Bemidji in the distance. Bet I could still get 2 inches. Bet I could. My days began with a 10-mile ride into town. I pedaled the ice cream bike for 6, and then I returned the bike and stalked to Diamond Point Park. After paying my boss like the good proletarian I was, I began the long trip home. The roadside landscape was punctuated by swamps and cows, often together. I always felt kinship with the cows. They were mired to their bellies in the swamp, and yet they held their heads up away from the muskeg and chewed the tough marsh grass with looks of noble resignation. Like those of monarchs being pulled from their thrones by a mob. There was one dairy farm along the way owned by Gus Hall, the actual head of the Communist Party USA. So maybe those cows were the cows of the people. You'd see Gus handing out flyers in front of the J.C. Penney at the Paul Bunyan Mall. I spent most of those 10 miles fantasizing. Once I conjured up a white pickup, a dream coming out of the heat ripples on the road, driven by 2 women in halter tops. They slow down and pull up alongside me. They couldn't get enough of me, evidently, and they spoke. And this is my fantasy, right? "You look so strong," offered one. I agreed that I was indeed strong. "But maybe you want to ride," the first one said, suddenly shy, because she wasn't usually so bold. "Yeah," said the driver. "We'll take you wherever you want to go." I stopped and took my feet out of my clips. "Any chance you're headed to Pleasure Town?" I said with studied nonchalance that was both cool and friendly. They laughed. "And he's funny," said one. I agreed that I was indeed funny. They pulled over to the shoulder, and the gleaming truck stopped and rocked gently on its springs, and I lifted my bike into the bed with one smooth, swooping gesture of my bulging, sweat-sheened arm. The women in the passenger seat slid over to make room. It was a Toyota, so it wasn't a full-size pickup, at least, my fantasy. So I had no choice but to put my arm around her, because it's a small truck. There was no place else to put it. They shifted, and off we went in the distance, beyond which, invisible but waiting for all of us, was Pleasure Town. But I was interrupted before I got there. The truck and the women disappeared. As I was biking home, I saw that there was a package in the ditch. I got off my bike and scurried through the grass. The package was rectangular and heavy, wrapped tightly in a black plastic garbage bag and silver duct tape. I took out my pocket knife and slid it open. And as though anxious to meet me, out spilled at least 20 Hustler, Jugs, Playboy, and We magazines. At the time, when I showed these to my brother, we didn't speak French at the time. So we didn't know how to pronounce that, so we just pronounced it owie. It was high culture. We had no high culture in Bemidji. I was on my knees and looked down at this treasure in my hands, then up at the sky. "Thank you," I whispered. The Great Spirit, or Yahweh, or whatever, distant and inscrutable till now, smiled down at me. I knew who I was, finally and at long last. I was someone who God loved. I was not merely among the chosen ones. I had been chosen. Proof was in my hands. Then my communion was interrupted. A pickup slowed to a stop and rocked on its springs. Not a Toyota. Not driven by women. The window rolled down. I held my breath. "You okay?" It was our neighbor Chuck. A Pall Mall stuck to his lower lip. "Yep," I said, my voice shrill. "Backpack exploded." Exploded, huh? It's possible this had different meaning for Chuck, who was a World War II veteran. "Yep, zipper, probably the zipper." "You want a lift? Put your bike in the back." "Not necessary." "You look sweaty." "Hot out." "You sure?" "Yep." "Positive." "Crazy weather." "Crazy." "Yep." "Just got my truck out of the shop." "Shop," I said. "Okay then." "Okay." And Chuck drove off, and I stuffed my treasure into my backpack and pedaled home as fast as I could. Most of you, both here and online, most of you don't know what it's like to be 13 and to bask in the glow of God's favor. Let me tell you, it's good. It's very good. What was once a secretive, cave-dwelling kind of life expanded into sherbet-hued paradise on earth for me. Those women and the manhood I thought they conferred on me kept me company in the morning before work, during bathroom breaks across the lively burg of Bemidji, Giovanni's, Dairy Queen, the Whispering Pines Motel, the Orbit Inn lobby bathroom, Food for Less, Lucan's Village Foods, the Markham Hotel, City Hall, the public library, when I got home from work, before dinner, after dinner, and to top it off, right before I closed my eyes. Lucan's, bud. Lucan's. And it did feel like they made me more of a man, whatever that was. Cooler, at least. Luckier. More Eddie Van Halen and less Eddie Munster. Those summer days and nights were blessed, plentiful, and right. I felt bigger and better and older than everyone else I knew now that I'd stopped worrying so much. My head was in the clouds, though I smelled like a pancake from all the Crisco. But I couldn't just leave my magazines lying about. What would my parents think? I didn't share the stash with Anton that much. God chose me, after all, not my older brother. If the Great Spirit had wanted him to pleasure himself 5 times a day, he would have shown his light on him. I had a desk, a big, heavy oak number on a pedestal, and there was an empty space under the file drawer, and I kept my scriptures there. A few weeks later, I went on a bike trip with a friend and his parents. It was a hard separation, but the ladies, as I thought of them, wanted me to live a full life. They were clear: go have adventures, be with your friends, see the world, get exercise. The trip lasted a week. The only places we went were Deb's, Black Duck, Deer River, Ball Club, and Grand Rapids. There was a message waiting for me at my friend's house when we got back. Don't come home. Call your parents at the Holiday Inn. I knew what happened. It was obvious. They'd found my stash. And they were disappointed. More than that, they were disgusted. And they'd gotten me a room at the Holiday Inn because they were kicking me out. I was in agony, stewing in shame and confusion. Eventually, my father's car rolled into the yard. He hugged me close and didn't wait until we were in the car to give me the bad news. David, bad news. The house burned down while you were gone. Thank God. You're not kicking me out? What? It burned down? Like, all the way? Do you want to go to the hotel, or do you want to see it? I guess I'll see it. It'll be a bit of a shock. How did it start? We were passing the communist's farm. It's not your fault, David. How could it be my fault? I just want you to know it's not your fault. Okay. When did it happen? Tuesday. I'd left on Monday. I was in the clear. I couldn't have burned it down. We drove up, the house came into view, and it was as though someone had taken the top off of it. The fire had started in the garage and blown through the front of the house and then climbed the stairs and burned away the roof and the top floor. I didn't say much of anything. It's okay if you want to cry. That was, I think, his way of saying that he wanted to cry. You can go in, the floor is solid, if there's anything you want to save. I knew somehow what losing the house meant for my parents. They didn't take vacations. They didn't do things like ski or snowmobile. We'd never had a boat or a four-wheeler or an RV. Everything they made, they put into the house. My mom, because she grew up in squalor. My father, because he was a refugee. Now, all of that, all of their hopes, all of their effort, all of their life was a ruin. I sensed this somehow, despite my own self-involvement. I walked up the half flight of stairs to the kitchen and then up the next half flight to the hallway that led to my room. I felt like I was walking through a garden of ashes. The floor was ash, the walls with their baseboards like banker shoes tapered off into charred timbers, and that gave way to the sky. My father walked behind me. It burned on the Tuesday, and the fire department came, of course, and then it rained Tuesday night. The fire and smoke didn't get it, the rain did. And then we arrived at my room. My bed was there, my dresser, the bookshelves, all of it had been knocked over. They check for sparks and embers after a fire to make sure it doesn't restart. That's why it's like this, my father offered. My desk had been flipped over. There they were. The ladies were scattered around, the pages flipped open and fanned all over the floor. They were ruined. Pages swollen. Images bled through, so what was already physically unlikely was now physically impossible. One magazine was open to a lady taking a bubble bath, and it was as though the bath had overflowed and drowned all the others in the magazine. My jar of lotion sat in the corner of the room, like a sad, perverted garden gnome. You okay? Asked my father. Who was here? Well, Everyone. The fire department. All the neighbors came to help, of course. Friends. Your parents' friends, of course, and teachers from your school. So, everyone. Your stuff is at Service Master. They can work on some of the smoke damage, but I wouldn't hold out any hope. Everyone had seen my ladies. Worse than that, they'd seen me. And there was no way they would unsee me. No way at all. He giveth, and he taketh away. Most of you don't know what it's like to be 13 and to know that God hates you. Let me tell you, it's bad. It's very bad. Anything else worth saving? I don't know. Is Smokey okay? Safe. Everyone else, the twins? Tony, Mom? Safe. Everyone's safe. I think the rest of this is probably ruined. Probably. We walked down the stairs, my father in front. His shoulders were slumped, and he looked left and then right, then left again, scanning for anything that could be saved, anything he'd overlooked. The sun had come out. Hey, Dad. Yup. You know, we're going to be okay. Like, everything is going to be okay. You think so, David? Well, sure. Why not? So we left. Soon I'd be swimming with the twins and Anton at the Holiday Inn. It was not Pleasure Town. It's the Holodome. The pool was surrounded by plastic plants and astroturf, and the hotel had shuffleboard and foosball and ping pong and video games. The ceiling was dome-shaped and made of glass through which I could see the summer sky. Night was coming on slowly. The twins were splashing each other and screaming. Anton was in the hot tub and looked very uncomfortable, but he smiled when he saw me walking up, pale and exposed in my swimsuit. Mom got in the pool and swam with us. Dad read the paper and then put it down to join Anton in the hot tub. My parents had lost everything. I guess I had too. Our laughter, however, and the screams bounced off the dome and came back to us louder and clearer than you'd think possible. That's the end of my 13-year-old life. So I will answer any questions except those about being 13, because I think I've done quite enough of that. So please, I actually love questions. It's kind of a conversation stopper, isn't it?
I can ask a question if nobody else has.
Sure, Anna. Sure.
Well, I will save my thanks for the end. My question is, let me know if you want to answer it, but I'm curious how it feels to be so open and honest, especially about your life, especially when you have two children sitting in the front. To me, I'm not condemning that. I think that's amazing. You know, I come from a quite different background where people are really closed and they don't talk about, especially the bad aspects. So I'm curious if that's always been the case, if it took time to learn, if we can also pass the mic to one of your kids if they want.
You guys?
We've heard this story many times.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, we've heard this story like over and over again, and then we were excited when he finally put it into distinct words and then published it publicly.
Yeah.
Like so, anyone who wanted to read it could. So that's pretty.
Never embarrassed.
No, not really.
No, I was just surprised that he would just tell this to me. I was like 14 when he first told me. I was like, well.
There's two answers to your question, though, Anna. Like, one is just the personal familial answer, which is that, you know, I try not to front with my kids. Like, they see me as a complete human being who's deeply flawed, you know, and I don't think there's any point in trying to hide that from them, you know? And just how I relate to my children is just a matter of, you know, I'm just trying to be a normal human being with them, you know? You know, yeah, I could pretend to think very highly of myself and then come at my kids that way, but that would be rather insincere, you know? As for the writing, you know, like one of the thrills of nonfiction writing, like, and the thrills of reading it I think. And this is according to Philip Lopate, who gives this really beautiful introduction to the art of the personal essay. He says something to the effect of, like, a large part of the drama of nonfiction is watching the writer slip down to even deeper levels of honesty, especially when that's unflattering. It's that sort of deep dive that personal essays take, where and no one wants to read a personal essay that is sort of hero worship, where the writer is sort of worshiping themselves as a kind of a hero or the main character in their own story. They're not very interesting to read. They're not interesting to write. And at least for nonfiction, for me, that's not where the work is happening. This violence book is something I felt a crisis in my life in 2015, which I don't think in this draft I did a very good job of isolating. Like, it's a first draft, and I got to give myself some credit and cut myself a little bit of slack. But the crisis is in me. I'm worried about myself. Are suddenly confronted with this feeling of, like, I don't know how to protect them. I don't know how to protect myself. I don't know how to live. I don't know how to live in this country. And I feel like there's violence at the heart of it. That is the original sin. That is the first thing. And that all of our other problems arise from that in one way or another. I think racism arises from that. I think the institution of race-based slavery arises from that. I think the ways in which we, take and took land and expanded our country and pushed the frontier, all of that, violence is implicated in all of those and gives rise to sort of, and is now being sort of felt and expressed and displaced and emerging almost like a cancer in places you wouldn't expect. I think school shootings are a manifestation of sort of a public ritual of violence that we participate in, all of us, not as perpetrators, sometimes as perpetrators, sometimes as victims, sometimes as community members, as people online. All of us are sort of arranged around this, and I think of school shootings as a kind of ritual that we've evolved because we have this violent urge built into our national character, and it needs expressing, So the journey is a journey into me and through that, and so it is hard, though, to write about myself. It's and to say, in a way that's, I'm no hero, I remember, just for an example, like, in my first book of nonfiction, Res Life, I do talk at length about my grandfather's death by suicide and how I was asked to clean up the mess by my grandmother. She's like, I need you to go up there and clean up what he did, and so that no one knows what happened. You got to clean up everything. And I don't want to see any blood or anything, and I don't want anyone to see that. And you have to clean out the entire room. If that means ripping out the floor, you rip out the floor. And I'm like, okay. She's like, yeah, your uncles can't see that. And I'm thinking to myself at the time, like, what makes you think I can see that? What makes you think? And the answer is unflattering. She didn't think much of my relationship with my grandfather. She didn't think much of me. So I could have written that as like, I'm the hero and did the hero thing, and I did this hard thing, and look at me, I did the hard thing. But that's not the truth. The truth is, I was suckered into doing the hard thing. I felt like I couldn't say no, and I shouldn't have been asked in the first place, and I did it anyway, and I suffered. So the nonfiction project of nonfiction, right, is to get in there, So thanks for the question. Yeah, it's funny, is it like, in The Magic Mountain when Hans Castorp remembers those hermetically sealed canning jars that their old maid used to put away, that they're like perfectly preserved from time, and that's how my talk was, and so it can't be penetrated, so there's no questions? I think we scared them off. Yeah. Kim.
I'm going to ask this question. I'll ask an easy question first. What road were you? I'm from Bemidji. I'm probably the only person who knows all these areas that he's talking about. What road did you find the porn stash on?
It was on Old Cass Lake Highway, kind of by School Lake. And actually by the junction with the Grace Lake Road.
Okay.
So I think someone came to the T-junction and tossed it, you know. And I think they wanted to retrieve it later, maybe. Maybe they tossed it because their wife or significant other were like hot on their tail, you know.
I found many stashes as a babysitter in Bemidji.
That's fantastic.
Many. I'm wondering, this ties in with the question just asked, but did you talk to your father a lot, who I knew, and served pancakes to at the Country Kitchen restaurant? Did you talk to him about these topics? Or did you have a more distant relationship to him? And he was a syndicated columnist, and I found him also, his own writing didn't, or that what I read in high school didn't touch on this stuff so much.
Yeah, my father, it's a little bit heartbreaking for me. And I think it was a lot heartbreaking for him that he wrote and talked about his life, his past, you know, his Holocaust experiences, his experiences after, all of that stuff. He talked about it all the time. He wrote about it all the time. But he had no distance from his subject. He didn't know how not to make himself the hero of any story that he told, you know? And so that writing of his was never met with any kind of success. Other kinds of writing of his were the columns that you read in the paper and things like that. But this stuff, it just hung around him like he wanted desperately to be a novelist and also a memoirist and to write about these things. And he was never quite able to do it well, to be perfectly honest. Despite the fact that he was a brilliant man and he was a very good writer, like technically. He wrote clean. Like I'm just envious to this day of how fast he could type, how cleanly he wrote. He worked as a journalist for years after the war, you know, where he really perfected a very kind of tight prose. Like it's astounding and lucid. I wanted him to write history. I think he would have been perfect at that. He didn't want that. You know, he wanted these other things. And so it always makes me a little sad, like he never quite did it, you know. But he talked about it all the time, all that stuff, you know. He was a very, if you remember, very emotional man, you know, cried all the time, which used to drive me crazy as a kid. And I was always jealous of my friends and their Scandi dads, you know. I'm like, why can't I have a dad like that? You know, a dad who's like, you know, I don't know, a little bit distant, kind of stoic, doesn't say all that much. Like me. No, just kidding. You know, I was really jealous of all my friends' fathers when I was a kid. And then it was only later I realized that, like, I got so lucky. You know, he was a deep feeling man, and he taught me how to feel, you know? I didn't really realize that to many years later. He was such a surprising guy, you know? I mean, like, as he was dying, he had Alzheimer's. So his mind is just, and it's painful, right? It's a painful disease for anyone, but for someone who's survived by their wits, to lose them is very hard to watch, you know? And I was living with him and taking care of him for a chunk toward the end. And we're having lunch. Every day, I was living at his house. Every day I come downstairs, he's like, David, what are you doing here? I'm like, well, I just thought I'd stay here for a while. He's like, oh, that's great news. Bad news, though. I've got Alzheimer's. I'm like, oh, Dad, that sucks. He's like, yep. Oh, well. You know, every day, same conversation, right? And so we were eating lunch one day, and I'd asked him, you know, and when people get Alzheimer's, the number of tapes they play in their head gets smaller and smaller and smaller until there's just like a couple songs left, you know? You don't hear new things. You go years not hearing a new thing come out of someone's mouth. And so we were in that phase. And we're eating, and I'm like, how was the food in the Army? Because when he fled to the States, he volunteered for the U.S. Army and served in the Philippines and Okinawa. And I'm like, how was the food? And I'd never asked him that before. He's like, food? I had no complaints. First time in my life that I got to eat 3 meals a day as much as I wanted. He was the least complaining person about physical discomfort that I've ever met in my life. Complained about his feelings all the time, but you know, and he's like, then he told me a story about being on the base in Okinawa. He's like, yeah, we were on the base and there was so much food, you know, like they just throw it in these big oil drums, you know, and then toss it. And he's like, but the people of Okinawa were starving to death. And so I just would take those drums of food and just bring them out in the alley behind the base, and people would line up and fill every kind of thing they could put another thing in. Shell casings, pails, hats. They were so destitute. They were starving, you know. They'd line up and they would just, and very calmly, in a very orderly way, they would help themselves to the stuff in these barrels. He's like, but then the base commander got wind of this, and he's like, you can't be doing that. And so he ordered the kitchen orderlies to dump bleach on the food. And so they did do that. They started dumping bleach on the food. My father, like, you know, when they moved to the States, they wound up accidentally in Yellow Springs, Ohio. And they lived in Yellow Springs. The only place they could afford was kitty corner from the AME church in Yellow Springs. So they lived in the black neighborhood of Yellow Springs. Those were his only neighbors, his only friends were people in the African-American community in Yellow Springs. And so, like, all the kitchen staff on this base were black. Because the Army, of course, right? We know the choices the Army would make about the service of different people based on race. And so my dad was talking to these guys, and he's just like, what do you guys think? Should we, let's disobey orders. Let's do it. Let's just not put bleach on it. And they're like, all right. You know, so they just disobeyed, pretend to bleach the food, and then they would bring it out there. And I asked my dad, and it's like, I'd never heard this story before, you know? And he was a big storyteller, and he repeated his stories a lot. Never heard this one. And it's coming at the very end of his life. And I'm like, I asked him like this question. I'm like, did that make you feel weird? And he's like, what do you mean? I'm like, I don't know. Like after Nanking, after Bataan, after, you know, all of that. He's like, what are you saying? I'm like, well, didn't it feel weird to help? You know, and he looked at me like I was just nothing. I remember the look on his face. He's like, they were starving human beings. That's all I needed to know. That's it. You know, I was just so ashamed of myself, you know. And he's just a good man, you know, complicated, made a lot of mistakes. He's hurt a lot of people in his life, sure, you know. But he's a good man. And he talked about that stuff all the time. Yeah. There's a couple. This one.
I'm just wondering if your mother, how far back did her historical knowledge of her family go? Do you know that?
Pretty far back. Yeah. I mean, you know, yeah, people just kind of talk. Yeah, sure. You know, deeply connected. I mean, it's one thing to, you know, find refuge or flee to another country. It's another thing to live in a certain place before time began. You know? I mean, it goes all the way back. It's kind of funny, though. My grandmother, who's completely Ojibwe, got a phone call. Like, she must have been in her 70s at the time. She got a phone call. This is during the time when, this was before the internet. So when people tried to scam you, they scammed you on the phone, you know. And this guy calls my grandmother. He's like, I've got some interesting news. I was doing some genealogical research. And he goes, you're going to be very surprised when I tell you what I'm going to tell you. He's like, but I've been doing some work on your family tree. And you have some really interesting ancestors. And, you know, if you buy my research, you know. She's like, but one thing that I found very fascinating, and you might be very excited to know this, is that one of your ancestors is Alexander the Great. This is a full-blooded Ojibwe woman from northern Minnesota, right? And she's just like... She's like, he made it this far. She's like, I had no idea. You know, I'm just hung up on him, right? So like, no, yeah, sure, you know, we know those things.
David, you're a wonderful storyteller. This was great fun to listen to you. And I'm curious, since you also write nonfiction, if you can help out the historians in this question of how you end a story. I mean, you don't have an argument in a non.
Well, yes, you do.
Right? So,
of course you do.
Do you think of yourself as writing an argument? Do you think of the beginning and the end together? Or do you write and then look for the logic and seek an end? How do you figure out the relationship between the beginning and the end?
That's a good question. But you know, even in, I mean, I guess my book, The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, is probably considered history. I don't think of it as such, although it's described as such. But there's certainly an argument in it. You know, I mean, it's rife with argument. But you know, for me, nonfiction is as much storytelling, and the history that I do in my nonfiction is storytelling of the same magnitude as the storytelling I do in my fiction. It's just different tools. So I definitely think of, you know, problem, tension, conflict, rising action, climax, denouement. I think of all the structural parts, and just to use a very simple example of sort of novelistic structure. There are other novelistic structures, of course. I always think about that stuff.
So you think of the novelistic structure
sure.
as it applies?
Yeah, definitely. Or a structure. It may not be novelistic, but it's certainly storytelling, and I think of it that way. Absolutely. You got to turn the pages. You got to get the, you know, they got to turn the pages, and so you have to tell a story, and you have to give the person a sense the story is going someplace. You know, otherwise, why are they going to even keep going? Yeah.
David, thank you so much. That was really fantastic. I was wondering about the burning house.
Yeah.
As the motif that moved through the stories, and how, because
that's right.
you remember?
No. Only now that you pointed it out. Yeah.
Well, so my question was: is that we have the protection of the house, then we have the actually burnt down house.
Yeah.
How conscious are you in the putting together of this collection of the metaphor of that being that of the country itself connected to violence?
That's a great question. And I'm going to pretend like I've been very conscious of that through the entire crafting of what I've got so far, but I haven't been, to be perfectly honest. It's apt, you know. I mean, the idea of sort of, you know, the republic as a kind of house, right? And the idea of that kind of burning, like we've heard that a lot. We hear that in Baldwin. We hear that, you know, we hear it sort of optimistically in JFK's, you know, metaphors and so on. But so in political discourse, it's been used a lot, and in creative discourse too. I would say, in all honesty, like only somewhat, you know, like this book on violence, which the first part is in, the second part is not in. That's a standalone funny ha-ha thing, which is not going to be in my serious thing. My porno will not be in The Savage Mind. But it's been a hard book to write, and hard in ways that I'm not used to admitting, you know. It's put me in touch with stuff that happened when I was a kid, like thinking about the project. It's stuff that, like this event, which I've always told as a funny story. My brother Anton and I are like, remember that time? You know, it's just like, no, really, sit around talking with friends and joking, and like, remember that time, you know, we almost shot our uncle? Like, that's so funny. You know, really, and then like everyone will laugh. You know, when I see Del, you know, Delbert, my cousin, like, remember that time you almost shot your dad? He's like, oh, right, you know. But now I'm thinking about it again, and I'm realizing there's damage there, you know, to me. And so it's been a hard book to write. It's been hard stylistically and as well, because I feel like I don't have, and you could probably hear it in the sample that I did read, that itself is sort of unstable, and it's a little wandery, and it's a little jumpy. At least that's how it felt to me when I read it to you all tonight. I haven't quite landed on the right focal length from my subject. I haven't figured out how I'm going from thing to thing, you know. And so the overall motifs are coming into focus now. And so, like, the burning house, possibly. Have I been thinking about it as sort of an overarching sort of motif or theme or idea? Not yet, because I'm not sure what the later parts are. But it would be useful. It'd be great if I just knew what I was doing, you know. But honestly, I mean, you know, some writers are really good at making a brand. I'm jealous of them, in a way. Philip Roth, Louise Erdrich, John Irving in a way, you know, Toni Morrison in a very different way. I'm not good at that. Like, I'll do a thing, and then I'm like, and I'll tackle a thing because I don't know how to do that thing. And then once I figure out how to do the thing by doing the thing, I don't want to do that anymore. You know, because I did it. It's not fun anymore to keep trying to just keep doing the thing I've already done. It's not engaging. You know, so I have no idea. The feeling of not knowing how to do the book is a very familiar feeling, but this one is particularly hard. I think I'm getting there, you know, and Becky, my editor, if you're listening, I'm definitely getting there.
We have one last question from an online viewer, and it's about the title of your book, which alludes to Levi Strauss's Savage Minds. Levi Strauss uses the figure of the savage, translated from the French also as wild, to talk not only about indigenous life worlds, including totemism, but to reflect on how cultural meaning is grounded in metaphor and analogy. How are you reframing the word savage in your memoir?
That's such a great question, and I'm glad that this anonymous asker asked it. I was an anthro major. I kind of feel like I'm at one of those meetings where we don't use last names. Like, my name is David, and I'm an anthropologist. And then you say, "Hi, David." I'm like, it's been 20 years since my last ethnography. It's been a tough week, though. I've been tempted. Yeah, but, so I was an anthro major, and I got my PhD in anthropology. Levi-Strauss was part of my diet in those days, and I really didn't like him. I misread him a lot when I was younger because I was offended by how he talked about Native people. I was offended by how the whole discipline talked about and used Native people. But I've matured. I've gotten over it to a degree. And so, yeah, Levi-Strauss is talking about the savage mind, you know, and by that he means, like, he's using Aboriginal or, you know, Native cultures to talk about the ways in which we build meanings through sort of structural oppositions, you know, and hot, cold, raw, cooked, light, dark, above, below. For example, like, it's sort of deep structural thinking. And so I'm looking at sort of how America's thinking, and so I'm kind of doing the same thing, in a way. But it's also an inversion, right? It's like the savage mind is not the primitive mind. The savage mind is the American mind, right? But there's also a third entendre, I guess, you know, which is that the savage mind. I mind. You know? I mind about sort of how we're talked about, how we're used, you know. And I mind greatly, you know, by sort of what our country seems insistent on doing, and to continue doing. So yeah, there's all sorts of plays. I'm glad they picked up on that. That's kind of fun. My editor, Becky, if you're watching this, I can't hide it any longer. That is going to be the title. I know you don't like it. I'm sorry. Thank you. Thank you.